Hello, boys and girls. We're going to try something a little bit different tonight. We're going to read chapter 4 of Escape from Asylum. Here we go. If I can do this with one hand. Breakfast occurred at 7, lunch at noon. Predictable, regimented. When Ricky asked the sharp-faced nurse escorting him to lunch what he could expect to eat, she shook her head and said with a humorous chuckle, "Soup and bread, Mr. Desmond. Soup and bread. That's all you're going to get around here, Desmond." She wasn't as nice or as quick to blush as Nurse Ash. Breakfast had been soft porridge and eggs, not quite scrambled and not quite real. He suspected, but powdered eggs nonetheless. Nothing one could possibly choke on. He guessed that there was a reason behind the soup and bread, too. He ate his lunch in observant silence, his eyes scanning the cafeteria, which seemed to be a large, multi-purpose room, with a gated corridor to the kitchen and an arched doorway to the main hospital hall that could be shut up and locked if necessary. White, everything was white and blisteringly clean. It was clean enough to eat off the floors in here, but luckily they hadn't made him do that yet. Rain drummed against the walls. He could hear it distantly, a reminder that life continued on while his stalled inside Brookline. The soup draining off his spoon was the color of distilled blood. At one point it had probably resembled a hearty, I'm going to switch the page here. A hearty vegetable soup, but it had been watered down and restituted to a tepid tomato-flavored water that the occasional chunk of celery. Setting down his spoon, Ricky watched a few other patients file into the room. Oh, excuse me. Oh, that was my face. Okay, here we go. They weren't even talking. The other patients were eating so quickly that Ricky hurried to finish his soup, figuring they knew something that he didn't. Nurses stood at opposite ends of the long, white tables wearing identical expressions on their faces, and their eyes roamed the room. At the table in front of him, an elderly woman sat elbow to elbow with a short-haired girl who looked like she wanted to glance over her shoulder, maybe to catch his eye. But each time she started to turn, she glanced first at the nurses and thought better of it. Ricky scraped the last of the soup out of the bowl and crammed half of the stale roll into his mouth. The nurses began walking down the bench behind them, tapping each patient on the shoulder, their signal to leave. A big, broad-shouldered hulk down the bench from Ricky hesitated, taking an extra second to eat some soup. "Dennis." She clapped once, and Ricky watched wide-eyed as the giant man scrambled up off the bench, hanging his head as if he were a kid caught with his hand in the candy jar. Whatever the nurses did here kept their patients in line, and it was clearly working. When the rain stopped, they were marched outside for work hour. Ricky stood in the grass, stared up at the dull sky, letting records play in his hand. Otis, Stevie, Smokey, all of the records that he could only play when he was at home alone. His parents hated his taste in music, especially Butch. Ricky wrinkled his nose as Nurse Ash appeared in the yard, carrying a basket filled with gardening gloves. Yeah, this felt about right. Chore duty usually landed heaviest on his shoulders when Butch came home early from work and caught him playing Smokey Robinson's latest on full blast. On Butch's hi-fi, no less. "I won't have any of that gosh darn noise in my house. A man wants peace and quiet when he gets home." Oh, Butch, I don't think my mother would appreciate that kind of language in the house. Outside, Carrick, now! Nurse Ash didn't scream at him as she handed him a pair of gloves. She was still great and tidy as the other nurses, but now Ricky noticed her hair looked wilder under her hat, and she clipped or curled or rolled into a perfect bun. What am I supposed to do with her? With these? He asked wryly. Put them on your hands, I imagine, Nurse Ash responded, equally dry. He smirked. I figured out that much, but he nodded to the other patients, who had grabbed pairs of gloves and immediately peeled off the predetermined locations to begin their work. Every day after lunch, we have supervised gardening. We can't. Next page. And there we go. Oh, here we go. Oh, okay, we're back. We can't let you have anything too sharp, obviously, but Warden Crawford thinks this kind of exercise is good for you. Why don't you join Kay? She's going to deadhead the... Oh, how do I say this word? Azaleas. Oh, the azaleas, okay. Groovy, he muttered. Before Nurse Ash could move down to the next patient, he said, Look, do you think... Is there a way you could maybe put in a good word for me? Or with that warden guy? I really need to talk about my mother. If I could just make one phone call, it would mean the world to me. Instead of rejecting his request outright, she calmly handed a pair of gloves to the patient after him. Right when he'd reassigned himself to being ignored, she asked, Is something the matter? Ricky's guffaw was so loud it startled everyone in the yard. All eyes were on him as he cleared his throat and lowered his head, trying to shake off their attention. I don't belong here, he said, softer. Look at me. Can't you tell I'm not one of these people? I'm not crazy. She sighed. Order, routine, discipline, and yes, occasionally correct medication. That's what we do here. That's what keeps our patients healthy. That's what keeps them from harming themselves. She paused and then said significantly, or others. Right. So maybe their incident had really landed him in Brookline. Maybe this had nothing or little to do with him and Martin. It was one time, he whispered. Your stepfather had a fractured wrist, she pointed out. Try to get along here, Ricky. It's for your own good. Order, discipline. Yeah, I got it. Ricky yanked on the gloves and turned slightly, facing the driveway beyond the wrought iron fence. A row of bushes, azaleas, apparently grew along the fence, outlining the borders of his prison in green and pink. A serious-looking and seriously strong male orderly guarded the gate itself, while the other girl, Nurse Ash, had pointed out and knelt next to one of the azalea bushes. The morning mist that should have dissipated by now hung like a wreath of smoke around the fence. A ghost spread across the entire yard. He made his way toward the girl, but kept his eye on the gate. Ricky briefly considered rushing the guard, but between the sedative, the eggs, and the watery tomato soup, he didn't really have enough energy to do the tackling. You can stop looking at the road, the girl said when he reached her. He hadn't noticed her watching him. Her eyes were still on the azaleas. Nobody's coming for you. Too bad. Not yet, anyway. The yard sloped down toward her and the bushes, and he knelt beside her. Recognition dawned. She was the girl who tried to scope him out during lunch. She was black and her hair was cut short, unevenly, but even the bald patches couldn't take away the fact that she was a looker. Tails, tall, slender, managing to look poised even in the baggy sack-like shirt and trousers they had given her to wear. He rested his knees in the mud and started picking at the flowers, even though they weren't really they were obviously dead. What happened to your hair? They make me cut it short, so I tear it out sometimes instead, she said softly, sadly. Her voice was gentle and low, and if someone was sleeping nearby. Ricky had met a few New Yorkers at Victorwood and Hillcrest, and he could hear a similar influence in her accent, though he couldn't be sure. Order, next page. Do this with one hand, here we go. Okay. Order and discipline aren't really my style. Never seen you here before. I'm new, Ricky replied. He stopped his picking, turning fully toward her. My name's Rick, or Ricky. Carrick, actually, but that's only when I'm in trouble. And right there, boys and girls, we're on page 36. Oh, here we go. Oh, there we go. We're on page 36. We're going to finish this up next time. Starting to lose my voice. And everybody have a great night. Bye.